The morning Henrietta Keller discovered the truth, she was already holding the biscuit in her hand. It was still warm. That was the part that broke her completely open, standing there in the doorway of the Cooper kitchen, with the sun barely cresting the Guadalupe Mountains to the east, the air carrying that sharp November bite that came off the high desert like a warning. The biscuit was wrapped in a square of cheesecloth, tied with a piece of twine that had been knotted twice, carefully, the way a child ties something precious so it cannot come undone. And sitting beside the cold iron stove, her dark braids still loose from sleep, her eyes enormous and watchful, was 8-year-old me Cooper. Me, who had never once spoken directly to Henrietta since her arrival 6 weeks ago. Me, who watched her from doorways the way a desert hawk watches something it has not yet decided about. Me, who had apparently been waking before dawn every single morning to wrap the last biscuit from the previous night's supper in cheesecloth and set it beside Henrietta's bedroom door like an offering laid at a shrine. Henrietta had not known. For 6 weeks she had simply found a biscuit waiting for her each morning and assumed it was left over from breakfast and set aside by accident. She had eaten every single one alone, quickly, guiltily, the way she had learned to eat things that felt too good to last. Now she stood with the biscuit in her hand and me staring up at her, and it was the child's expression that undid her. Not shy, not guilty at being caught. Solemn. Deeply, carefully solemn, the way children look when they have made a decision that cost them something and they are waiting to see if it was worth the price. "You saved this for me," Henrietta said. Not a question. Her voice came out cracked and strange. Me nodded once, precise. Every morning. Another nod. Henrietta's throat closed entirely. She had come to this ranch in Culberson County, Texas in the autumn of 1883 as a woman running from a secret dark enough to bury her, answering a newspaper advertisement placed by a widower rancher who needed a housekeeper and occasional help with his daughter. She had come expecting nothing. She had been promised nothing. She had arrived prepared to endure, to work, to survive the way she had been surviving for 3 years. She had not been prepared for this. A child she had never managed to reach, saving her the last biscuit every morning like it was a sacred thing. The betrayal that had brought Henrietta Keller to this remote corner of West Texas had started, as most betrayals do, with a man who smiled beautifully. His name was Gerald Fitch, and he had been the deputy land commissioner of Biscuit County, and Henrietta had trusted him with everything she had, which in the spring of 1880 amounted to the deed to her father's house, 60 acres of Good Hill country farmland, and the last of her inheritance. She had been 24 years old and freshly orphaned, and Gerald Fitch had told her he could protect the land from the railroad men who were pressing from all sides. He had instead sold it. Not transferred it, not lost it to some legal technicality she might have grieved cleanly. Sold it. To the very railroad consortium that had been circling it like vultures, pocketed the money, and filed papers that made it appear Henrietta herself had authorized the sale. When she had gone to the courthouse to contest it, she had found her own forged signature on 3 separate documents and a deputy land commissioner who had been quietly reassigned to a position in Austin and was entirely unavailable for questioning. She had tried to fight it for 2 years. She had spent everything she had left hiring a lawyer in San Antonio who eventually told her, with genuine apology but no alternative, that the paperwork was too perfectly done, and the men behind it too powerful, and she should consider the land lost. She had considered it. She had also considered what it felt like to have the only solid thing remaining of her parents stripped away by a man who had looked her in the eye and promised safety. It felt like learning that the ground itself could lie. She had worked her way west after that, taking positions as a housekeeper, a cook, a schoolteacher's aide, a seamstress, moving every time someone started asking questions she could not answer cleanly, moving every time the loneliness became too heavy to carry in one place, moving toward something she could not name but kept believing existed somewhere ahead of her, past the next ridge, past the next dry river crossing, past the next town whose name she learned only well enough to leave it. The advertisement in the Val Verde County Gazette had been brief and completely honest, which was itself so unusual that it had stopped her cold when she read it in a boarding house in Del Rio in September of 1883. Widower rancher, Culberson County, seeks steady woman for housekeeping and child care, hard work, fair pay, no pretense required, references checked but circumstances considered. Write to O. Cooper, Box 14, Sierra Blanca, Texas. No pretense required. She had written the letter that same afternoon, sitting at the boarding house's one writing table, her hand shaking slightly with something she was almost afraid to identify as hope. She had told him the truth about the land fraud. Not all of it, not every humiliating detail, but enough. She had told him she had no references from the last 3 positions because she had left each of them under the pressure of circumstances she was not yet free to fully explain. She had told him she was 30 years old, unmarried, and experienced in running a household. She had told him she was serious about hard work and deeply unserious about pretense. Oscar Cooper had written back in 8 days, which given the mail routes through West Texas was practically by return post. His handwriting was large and slightly uneven, a man who had learned to write adequately but who did not do it often enough to make it graceful. He had said her letter was the most honest one he had received in response to his advertisement. He had said he valued honesty above all references. He had said his daughter's name was Me, and she was 8 years old, and had not spoken much since her mother died 2 years ago and was not easy, but was worth the difficulty. He had said the pay was $12 a month plus room and board, and he would send stage fare if she wanted to come see the place before committing. She had used her last $4 to get to Sierra Blanca and had not waited for stage fare. The Cooper Ranch sat 15 miles east of Sierra Blanca in a fold of high desert land that in the late afternoon light turned colors Henrietta did not have names for. Red deeper than brick, gold that went nearly orange, shadows so purple they looked painted. The house was adobe and timber, solid, well built, the kind of structure a man had put real thought and real labor into, with a long covered porch facing south, and a garden bed along the east wall that had clearly been tended once and was now largely overtaken by drought-tough weeds. Oscar Cooper had met her at the end of the lane when the buckboard from Sierra Blanca dropped her off. He was 35 years old, broad through the shoulder, weathered in the way that outdoor men in West Texas were weathered, with deep lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been set in granite. His hair was dark brown and needed cutting. His boots were good quality but very old. He had looked at her arriving with one bag, and the expression of a woman prepared to be disappointed, and something in his own expression had shifted, though she could not have said toward what. He had taken her bag without being asked. He had said simply, "Glad you came." She had said just as simply, "I'm glad to be here," and had meant it more than she could explain. Me had not come out to meet her. Henrietta had seen her watching from behind the kitchen curtain, a thin, dark-haired girl with her father's serious eyes, and had pretended not to notice. The work itself was real and constant, and Henrietta had been grateful for both qualities. There was cooking and cleaning and mending, and the endless management of a household that had been running on bare efficiency for 2 years, since Oscar had lost his wife Clara to a fever in the autumn of 1881. There were chickens and a kitchen garden to be revived, and a smokehouse to be organized, and a root cellar that needed restocking before winter. There was Me's schoolwork to supervise, the girl attending the small schoolhouse in Sierra Blanca 3 days a week and needing to do her reading and arithmetic on the other 2, and she was smart, fiercely and quietly smart, the kind of intelligent that expressed itself in watchfulness rather than words. What there was not in those first weeks was any obvious warmth between Oscar and Henrietta beyond the civil and the practical. He was courteous. He was fair. He paid exactly what he had promised and never once asked her to do anything that was not her agreed work. He left her Sundays almost entirely to herself. He said thank you for every meal with the simple directness of a man who actually meant it rather than performing gratitude. But he was contained. Behind the courtesy, behind the fairness, there was something locked down very tight, a grief she could see in the way he sometimes stood at the window in the evenings looking out at nothing particular, a loneliness that he seemed to carry as a matter of chosen discipline, the way other men carried a rifle, always present but not displayed. She understood that. She had been carrying her own version of it for 3 years. The biscuits had started during the first week, though she had not understood what they were. She had simply found one every morning beside her door. She had assumed it was an oversight of some domestic variety. She had eaten them alone before the household woke because they were good and she was hungry and they were there. She had not known, until Me was caught in the kitchen at 5 in the morning with cheesecloth and twine and an expression of fierce private devotion, what had actually been happening. Why? Henrietta asked, crouching down to Me's level, the biscuit still warm between her palms. Me. Can you tell me why? Me was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Henrietta started to think the answer would not come. Then the girl said very quietly, as if she was not entirely certain she was allowed to say it, "You look hungry, not for food, just hungry." Henrietta sat down on the kitchen floor entirely. She had not meant to. Her legs simply stopped holding her up. Me did not move away. Instead, after a moment that stretched and breathed between them, the girl sat down on the floor beside her, close enough that their arms were nearly touching, and they sat together in the early morning dark while the desert outside went slowly from black to the deep blue of almost dawn. That was the morning everything changed. Oscar Cooper found them like that when he came in from the pre-dawn barn check at 5:30. 2 figures sitting on the kitchen floor in the blue dark, his daughter pressed against the side of a woman he had hired 6 weeks ago and was increasingly, uncomfortably aware of as something beyond a person he had hired. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene, and the thing in his chest that he had been keeping very carefully locked down shifted in a way that alarmed him considerably. He said, "Everything all right?" Henrietta looked up at him and her eyes were wet. She was clearly fighting not to show it and losing with dignity. She said, "Your daughter is extraordinary." Me looked at her father with the level, assessing look she used on everything she considered important, and then, very deliberately, leaned her head against Henrietta's shoulder. Oscar had to look away and find something to do with his hands. He located the coffee pot. The 3 of them had coffee and biscuits, the last ones from the night before and the first ones Henrietta had ever eaten in this house in the presence of other people. And nobody said very much, but the quality of the silence was entirely different from every silence that had come before it. That day, Oscar Cooper asked Henrietta to walk the fence line with him in the afternoon, a practical errand that required no company whatsoever, but which he presented as a task that benefited from 2 sets of eyes. She accepted with equal practicality, and they walked 3 miles of cedar post and wire fence through land that was extraordinary in its starkness. The Guadalupe Mountains white and enormous to the northwest, the desert floor patchy with creosote and ocotillo, and the occasional fierce spray of a yucca in bloom even this late in the season. He did not say anything deeply personal. He talked about the fence, and the cattle, and the problems with the water situation in the north pasture, and a neighboring rancher named Dawson who had been making noises about property lines that made Oscar's jaw tighten in the way she was learning to read as suppressed anger. She listened, and contributed practically, and did not push at anything he was not yet ready to open. But at one point, climbing through a wire gap in the fence, his hand had steadied her elbow, and when she was through and he had come through after her, he had not moved his hand for 2 seconds longer than was strictly necessary. Just 2 seconds. She had felt them both. He had let go and looked away at the mountains with the expression of a man who had surprised himself, and she had looked away at the desert floor with the expression of a woman who had spent 3 years not letting herself want things, and was finding that prohibition suddenly much harder to maintain. That evening at supper, Me asked Henrietta if she knew any stories. It was the first question Me had ever directed at her, and both of them knew it. Oscar went very still over his plate, the way a man goes still around something fragile. Henrietta thought about it seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. She said, I know one about a woman who got lost in the hill country in a thunderstorm and was found by a family of German settlers who kept bees, and who talked to her only in German for 3 days until they finally determined she was not a spy but just lost, and then fed her so much strudel she could barely walk. Me stared at her. Is that true? Every word, Henrietta said. The strudel part especially. Me looked at her father. Did it really happen? Oscar looked at Henrietta with something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory, a warmth at the edges, a pulling at the corners of his mouth. I'd believe it, he said. And me, for the first time in the presence of anyone outside her immediate family since her mother's death, laughed. It was brief and quickly suppressed, the laugh of a child who had forgotten she was allowed to do that. But it was real. Henrietta carried it to bed with her that night like the biscuits, carefully in both hands, afraid of dropping it. The man named Dawson became a problem the following week. His name was Rutherford Dawson, and he owned the Double D spread north of Oscar's property, a larger ranch that had been doing well on cattle, and doing better recently on the discovery that certain of its acreage sat over a reliable underground spring that made it valuable in ways that went beyond ordinary grazing. Dawson had been buying up neighboring land for 2 years, with methods that ranged from legitimate purchase to aggressive pressure to things that were probably not legal, but were conducted quietly enough that nobody had been able to prove anything in a county where proving things against Rutherford Dawson was a project that required considerable courage and no dependence. Oscar had dependence. He had me. This was the specific trap Dawson used, and he used it with precision. He appeared at the Cooper Ranch on a Wednesday morning in early November, riding a very good horse and accompanied by 2 men whose function was decorative rather than practical. And he stood on Oscar's porch with his hat in his hand and his smile on his face, and made Oscar an offer for the property. Henrietta was on the porch at the time, turning a mattress that needed airing. She had not been invited to this conversation, and she did not leave. She turned the mattress and kept her back mostly to them and her ears entirely present. Dawson's offer was insultingly below market value for land with a reliable water source, which Oscar's north pasture had. Oscar told him so politely. Dawson's smile did not alter. He said he understood the land had sentimental value, and he was prepared to add a consideration for that. The new number was marginally less insulting. Oscar said he was not selling. Dawson said he hoped Oscar would think it over. The men behind Dawson, who had not been introduced and did not introduce themselves, adjusted their positions in a way that was not threatening in any manner that could be cited, but was absolutely threatening in every way that mattered. After Dawson left, Oscar stood on the porch for a long moment with his hands flat on the railing and his eyes on the horizon. Henrietta set the mattress against the wall and said, "That is a man with a dark past and darker methods." Oscar looked at her sideways. "You got all that from airing a mattress." "I got all that from the way his men moved when you said no." He was quiet. Then he said, "He's been after this place for 8 months, longer since Clara died." She heard what he did not quite say. That Dawson had been waiting for Oscar to become sufficiently vulnerable. That Dawson considered a widowed rancher with a young daughter to be a sufficiently soft target. The specific cruelty of that made something cold and hard settle in Henrietta's chest. She said, "What's in the north pasture? Spring-fed pond. Only reliable surface water in a 3-mile radius. And he wants the water. He wants the whole piece, but the water's why." She thought of Gerald Fitch. She thought of forged signatures and pocketed money and a land commissioner who had made himself unavailable for questioning. She thought about what it felt like to be the person with the thing someone powerful wanted. She said, "He can't get it legally." "No, so he'll try other methods." Oscar turned to look at her fully. His expression was not quite surprise, but it was adjacent to it, the look of a man discovering that someone has been following a trail of thought he thought he was walking alone. "That's what I'm afraid of," he said. "Then we need to prepare for methods, not just offers," she said. "What kind of legal footing do you have? The deed, title searches, anything recorded at the county level?" He stared at her. "You know about deeds and title searches?" It was not quite a question. She met his eyes. "I know about what happens when you don't have them in order," she said. The particular quietness that followed was the kind that contains a question being considered and set aside for later. He said, "The deed is clean, filed in El Paso County, copy with the bank in Sierra Blanca, title's never been contested." "Good," she said. "Keep those documents somewhere other than this house." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "Henrietta." She had not realized until he said her name that he had not used it before. He had called her Miss Keller when he had to call her anything, and mostly he had managed without. Her name and his voice had a weight she had not anticipated. "What happened to you," he said, "before you came here?" She did not look away. "Someone took something from me using forged paperwork and the assumption that I was too isolated and too powerless to stop them." His jaw tightened in the way she knew now as suppressed anger. "The land you mentioned in your letter. My father's land, my land, gone. Were you able to do anything about it?" "Nothing sufficient." She paused. "But I learned everything there was to learn about what I should have done first." Oscar Cooper looked at her in the November desert light with the mountains behind her, and she watched him in the process of understanding something. Not just what she had told him, but what it meant about why she had told him. About why she had stayed listening when Dawson came. About why she knew to ask about deeds and title searches. He said, "Would you help me?" She said, "I already am." The thing between them after that was like a fire that has been built carefully in a good stone hearth, contained but entirely real, throwing warmth in all directions. Neither of them named it or rushed toward it. But it was present in every room they occupied together, in every conversation that ranged further than it needed to range, in the way he had begun to linger at the kitchen table after supper instead of disappearing to the books or the barn. Me noticed. Children in the business of careful observation always notice. She said nothing about it, but she began including Henrietta in the small domestic rituals she had previously kept separate: the evening check on the chickens, the Sunday arrangement of her mother's dried flower collection on the windowsill, the particular way she took her tea with a great deal of sugar and needed the cup placed just so on the table or it troubled her. These were not small gestures. They were enormous ones, dressed in small clothes. Henrietta understood them as such and honored each one with serious attention. The biscuits continued. Now Henrietta knew what they were, she began doing something about it. The first morning after the revelation, she had gotten up early enough to beat me to the kitchen, made a fresh batch, and when me appeared at 5 in the morning with her cheesecloth and her twine, she had found Henrietta already at the table with 2 plates, and the biscuits already out and a jar of the wild honey they got from a trader in Sierra Blanca. Me had looked at the table, then at Henrietta. Then she had sat down with an air of someone who had been expecting something surprising and was pleased to find it genuinely surprising. They had eaten together in the early morning quiet, and it had become, without either of them discussing it, the way mornings worked in the Cooper house. Henrietta up early, me appearing on her own schedule, the two of them at the kitchen table in the dark before sunrise, sometimes talking, often not. Me brought her schoolbook sometimes. Henrietta brought mending. The biscuits were always there. Oscar had discovered this arrangement around the 3rd morning of it and had simply started appearing himself, a little later than me but before full light, and sitting at the table with his coffee without comment, as if he were afraid that naming the thing might unsettle it. This was how the Cooper household began to become something it had not been in 2 years, which was a place where people chose to be rather than simply existed. The crisis with Dawson arrived in the 2nd week of November, sudden and precisely calculated. Henrietta was alone at the house. me at school and Oscar out checking the cattle in the south pasture when two men she had not seen before arrived on horseback. They were not Dawson's usual companions. These were quieter men, with the particular quality of stillness that she had learned to read as deliberate and professional, the kind of stillness that is not peace but control. They said they were surveyors. They said there was a question about the northern property boundary and they had been authorized to conduct a survey correction. They had papers. The papers looked official. Henrietta stood on the porch and looked at the papers and felt the cold, precise recognition of someone who had seen forged documents before and knew that the expertise of the forgery was not a reassurance but a warning. She said pleasantly, "Mr. Cooper is out on the property, but expected back within the hour. I'm happy to offer you gentlemen water and shade while you wait." They said they were on a schedule and would begin the survey and speak to Mr. Cooper when he returned. She said, still pleasantly, "I'm afraid I can't authorize anyone to begin surveying activity on this property without the owner present and consenting. I'm sure you understand." The taller of the two men looked at her with an assessing expression. He said, "Ma'am, this is a legal proceeding," she said. "Then it will keep an hour," and went inside and loaded Oscar's rifle, which she knew how to use because her father had taught her on the Hill country farm and she had not forgotten, and came back to the porch and sat down in the rocking chair with the rifle across her lap and her expression pleasant and entirely clear. The men left. She rode out to find Oscar 15 minutes later, cutting across the south pasture on his mare, and found him and told him what had happened with the calm specificity of someone who has already done what needed to be done and is now cataloging it for the record. He listened without interrupting, which she was learning was how he processed things that were serious, and when she finished he said, "You ran them off with my rifle." "I sat on the porch with your rifle across my lap," she said precisely. "There's a distinction. There's not much of one." "No," she agreed, "there isn't really." He looked at her on his mare in the middle of the south pasture with her hair coming loose from its pins and the rifle in the saddle scabbard beside her, and his expression did something complicated she could not entirely read except that it made her heart beat faster than the ride had. He said, "Those papers were forged." "Almost certainly." "How do you know?" "The seal was wrong. Not the design, the impression. Too shallow on the left side. Genuine county seals press evenly. Also, the date format used a slash rather than a period, which is not how Texas county offices record dates." Oscar was quiet for a moment. "Henrietta, how do you know that?" She met his eyes in the November desert light. "Because I spent 2 years examining every document that destroyed my family's land looking for exactly those kinds of errors and found them everywhere, and found out too late that finding them was not sufficient without a lawyer willing to press the case and a judge willing to hear it." The sentence sat between them in the desert air, carrying its full weight. He said, "We're going to El Paso." She blinked. "Pardon." "I'm going to take you and me and the deed and every document I have, and we are going to the El Paso County Courthouse, and we are going to sit in front of a judge and make the kind of record that Dawson cannot erase, and then we are coming home." He paused. "And I would like you to come with me not just because you know things about documents that I need to know, but because I don't want to go without you." The last part landed entirely separately from the first part. She heard both. She said, "When?" "Tomorrow morning. Then I'll need tonight to organize what we're taking." "All right." He turned his horse back toward the ranch. She turned his mare beside him. They rode the half-mile home side by side without speaking, and the silence had so much in it that speech would have only reduced it. The trip to El Paso was 3 days by wagon, which in November meant cold nights and days that were bright and brief. Oscar drove. Me sat between them on the bench seat with a blanket across her lap and her schoolbook in her hands, and the particular contentment of a child who has arranged herself exactly where she wants to be. Henrietta sat on me's other side and read aloud when me asked her to, which was often, and pointed out things worth seeing when the landscape offered them, which it did constantly. The Guadalupe Mountains passed to their north on the first day, enormous and lavender in the morning light, stippled with pine at the higher elevations in a way that always seemed improbable in the middle of the Chihuahuan desert. Me pressed against Henrietta's side and looked up at them with the expression of someone seeing something they already knew was important. Oscar watched both of them from the corner of his eye and said nothing. They camped the first night in a shallow arroyo that offered shelter from the wind, and Oscar built a fire, and they ate cold biscuits and salt pork and drank coffee that was mediocre but hot, and me fell asleep against Henrietta's shoulder before the fire had been going 20 minutes, and the two adults sat on either side of her in the firelight with the desert all around them. Stars so dense overhead it looked like an accident of riches, something impossible left there without authorization. Oscar said, quietly so as not to wake me, "She hasn't slept against anyone since Clara died." Henrietta looked down at the small head on her shoulder. "She's brave," she said. "Way she reaches for things, careful, but she reaches. She gets it from her mother." "Maybe," Henrietta said. "She might also get it from her father." He was quiet. The fire cracked and settled. He said, "I was not brave when Clara died. I was the opposite of that." "What were you?" "Absent, physically present and otherwise completely gone, for better than a year." He looked into the fire. "Me managed. She is 8 years old and she managed our household and managed me for a year, and I let her." "You found your way back," Henrietta said. "She found it for me." He looked at me sleeping. "She left biscuits by my door too, when I had stopped eating properly. She would save me food and leave it where I'd find it." He paused. "I did not know she had been doing it for you until you told me." Henrietta looked at him across the sleeping child. "She knows who is hungry," she said. The look he gave her in the firelight was something she had to look away from because it was too direct and too much, the look of a man who has been carrying something alone and is encountering the possibility that he might be allowed to set it down. He said, "I want to tell you something." "All right." "When you wrote that letter, when you told me about the land fraud, about the circumstances you could not fully explain, I almost didn't write back." He paused. "Not because of what you said, because of what I was afraid I would feel if you came and turned out to be what you sounded like." She was very still. "What did I sound like?" "Like someone worth knowing," he said, "and I was not certain I was ready for that." The fire settled again. Me breathed steadily between them. The stars burned overhead without any interest in human complication, indifferent and beautiful. Henrietta said, "I was not certain I was ready either." "Are you now?" She looked at him across the sleeping child, this man with his granite jaw and his deep eyes and his grief worn not as weakness, but as something he had walked through and come out the other side of, still standing, still tending. She said, "I am trying to be." He nodded once, the same precise way me nodded, the origin of the gesture suddenly entirely clear. They did not say anything further about it that night, but they did not need to. The fire burned down and they arranged me carefully in the wagon bed on a folded blanket and took turns keeping watch in the desert dark. And when it was her watch, Henrietta sat by the embers and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something other than the forward-leaning tension of a woman in motion, always moving before something caught her. She felt, cautiously but genuinely, like a woman who had arrived. El Paso in November of 1883 was a city in the particular process of becoming itself, the railroad having arrived several years prior, and changed everything about the scale and tempo of the place. Crowded and dusty, and loud, with the commerce of a border town that served as the passage point between two countries and the endpoint of cattle drives and the beginning of supply routes heading into territory that had no other convenient access. It smelled of cattle and coal smoke, and the Rio Grande and the particular sharp desert cold of a November afternoon in the Trans-Pecos. Oscar drove them to a hotel on San Francisco Street that was respectable without being expensive, and they took 2 rooms, which me negotiated in her serious way by stating simply that she wanted to be with Henrietta. And so Oscar had 1 room and me and Henrietta had the other. And this arrangement, made by an 8-year-old on entirely practical grounds, produced a flush along Oscar's cheekbones that he managed with impressive composure. The courthouse the following morning was a large adobe building that carried the particular institutional gravity of a place where official things happened, and they went to the land record's office, and then to the county assessor, and then, on the advice of a clerk who turned out to be genuinely helpful in the way that occasionally happens with government clerks, to a land attorney named Simon Arredondo, who had an office above a dry goods store on El Paso Street, and who looked at Oscar's documents with the concentrated attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. Henrietta told him about the survey crew and the forged papers, precisely and in detail. Arredondo listened and asked 2 questions, both of which were the right questions to ask, which told her he was competent. Then he looked at Oscar and said the situation had clear legal remedies, and he would advise filing an injunction in El Paso County that would make any future survey or boundary action legally contestable, and that the nature of the forged papers Henrietta had described suggested Dawson was operating on the assumption of isolated victims who lacked legal sophistication, and that disrupting that assumption was in itself a significant deterrent. Oscar hired him on the spot. Walking out of the attorney's office into the El Paso afternoon, Oscar had taken Henrietta's hand. Not with the ambiguity of steadying an elbow on a fence line. Clearly, directly, his large weathered hand around hers, fingers interlocked, as they walked down El Paso Street in the November light. Me, walking on Oscar's other side, looked up at their joined hands and then ahead at the street with an expression of extreme satisfaction that she was making no effort whatsoever to conceal. They stayed one more night in El Paso. Oscar took them to supper at a proper restaurant with tablecloths and actual menu cards, and me ordered with the careful seriousness of someone who understood this was a special occasion and wanted to mark it properly. And they ate and talked about things that were not Dawson or documents. And for the first time since Henrietta had arrived in Culberson County, she heard Oscar laugh. Actually laugh, not just the warmth at the edges of his expression, but a genuine, full sound, startled out of him by me's deadpan commentary on the sommelier's enormously important relationship with a bottle of wine. It was, she thought, exactly as good a sound as she would have predicted if she had let herself predict things. They drove home over 2 days, and the second day the sky turned that deep impossible blue of a West Texas winter day, cold and absolutely clear, and the mountains were white-capped, and the desert floor had that quality it sometimes got in clear cold weather of looking like something painted rather than something real, too vivid, too precise, the colors too decided. Oscar told her about Clara on the second day, quietly, in pieces, fitting it between the landscape and me's intermittent sleeping on the seat between them. Clara had been from a ranching family in Presidio County. They had married in 1872 when he was 24 and she was 22. She had been funny and practical and very good with horses. She had loved the land in the specific way that people who grow up on land love it, as a thing with character and personality rather than just territory. She had been sick for 3 weeks with the fever before she died, and had made Oscar promise 2 specific things: that he would keep the ranch, and that he would not let me grow up entirely surrounded by grief. He had managed the first promise. The second one had been harder. "I think," he said quietly, with the mountains to the north, "that you might be the answer to the second promise. I didn't plan it that way, but I think you might be." Henrietta watched the road ahead and felt the warmth of me sleeping against her side and the warmth of what he had said settling through her like the first serious heat after a cold morning. She said, "I didn't plan it either. Does that bother you?" "No," she said. "Unplanned things have mostly been what went wrong in my life. I find it interesting that an unplanned thing is what seems to be going right." He reached across me's sleeping form and found her hand on her knee and held it, and they drove the last miles home through the blue desert afternoon, with their hands linked across his sleeping daughter. They arrived home to find that someone had been through the house, not ransacked, not dramatically destroyed, but gone through in the precise and professional way of someone looking for something specific. Drawers not quite closed, papers not quite where she had left them. The false bottom of the kitchen flour bin, which Henrietta had created herself from habit and old caution, slightly misaligned. Oscar stood in the kitchen and looked at it, and his expression went a stone. Henrietta said they were looking for the deed copy. It was in the bank in Sierra Blanca. They may not have known that, or they may have been confirming it wasn't here. Me stood in the kitchen doorway, taking in the disturbed house with the gravity of a child who has been prepared for the world to contain threats, not out of terror but out of the intelligence of someone who has been paying attention. She said, "Did they take anything?" Henrietta checked the obvious places quickly and said, "Nothing I can find." Me said, "Then they didn't find what they wanted." Oscar looked at his daughter, then at Henrietta, then at the kitchen, which was her domain and her space, violated by people acting on Dawson's hidden motive, and something in his expression shifted from stone into something colder and more specific. He said, "I'm going to Sierra Blanca tomorrow to speak with the sheriff." "I'll go with you," Henrietta said. "I'd appreciate that." Me said, "I want to go too." Oscar looked at her and then made the decision that Henrietta could see he always made with me since Clara's death, which was to include her rather than protect her, because he had learned that she was better prepared by information than by sheltering, and that sheltering was what had nearly broken both of them when Clara died. He said, "Then you'll go." The three of them went to Sierra Blanca the following morning and spoke with Sheriff Ben Aldred, who was a compact man in his 40s with a very good mustache and the kind of steady, unhurried competence that sheriffs in isolated counties sometimes developed because they had to, there being no one else. He listened to everything and made notes, and said he was aware that Rutherford Dawson's methods had become more aggressive in recent months, and that he had been building a file on several suspicious incidents in the county, none of which he had yet been able to tie definitively to Dawson, but that the accumulation was becoming interesting. He looked at Henrietta. "You ran surveyors off with a rifle, ma'am." "I sat on the porch with a rifle on my lap," she said for the second time. "Yes, ma'am." His expression was serious, but his eyes were doing something else. "I might need to take a statement about those surveyors. The papers they carried might be checkable against the county records." "They'll be forgeries," she said. "The seal impression was uneven and the date format was wrong." Sheriff Aldred looked at her for a moment. "How do you know that?" Oscar Cooper said mildly, "She knows things." The sheriff's statement took an hour and was thorough and useful, and on the way out he said to Oscar, quietly but not quietly enough that Henrietta did not hear, "That's a formidable woman you've got there, Cooper." Oscar said, equally quietly, "I know it." She pretended she had not heard and felt warm all the way back to the ranch. December arrived with serious cold and serious work. The cattle needed winter management. The house needed weatherproofing. The root cellar needed its final stocking. The woodpile needed to be increased considerably. And all of this happened in a rhythm that was demanding and satisfying in the way that necessary work with visible results always is. Oscar and Henrietta worked beside each other through the shortening days with an ease that had nothing to do with how recently they had known each other, and everything to do with how well they had learned to read each other's pace and method. Me's school sessions became home-based through the worst cold, and Henrietta taught her at the kitchen table in the mornings, discovering in the process that Me's quiet intelligence was most alive when given problems rather than information, puzzles to work out rather than facts to absorb, which explained why the standard schoolroom approach had never quite captured her. She set me mathematical problems drawn from the real demands of the ranch, and me solved them with fierce, absorbed pleasure. She read aloud and asked me questions about motive and consequence rather than plot, and me answered with the kind of insight that made Henrietta set the book down sometimes just to think about what the girl had said. Oscar came in one midday to find me explaining to Henrietta, with considerable animation, why the protagonist of their current reading had made a decision that was rational but wrong. The distinction between rational and right being something me had apparently given considerable independent thought to. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and listened to his daughter talk for 4 straight minutes, something he had not heard her do in 2 years, and his expression was something that Henrietta could not look at directly. Later, after me had gone to do her afternoon chores, he said, "She argues now. She has opinions." "She has always had opinions," Henrietta said. "She was keeping them." "For what?" "For when it felt safe to offer them." He was quiet. Then he said, "Henrietta, I need to say something." She looked at him. "All right." "I placed that advertisement," he said, "because I needed help. That was the whole of it. I needed someone who could manage the house and help with me, and I was pragmatic about the arrangement." He paused. "And then you arrived, and I spent 3 days telling myself I was still being pragmatic." She waited. "I am not being pragmatic," he said. "I have not been being pragmatic for some time. I am aware that this is complicated given the circumstances, and that I am your employer, and that there are practical and appropriate reasons to be cautious, and I want to be honest with you about all of those things." "Yes," she said, "those things are true. I want to be honest about the other thing too." Her heart was doing something irregular in her chest. "What other thing?" "That I would like this to be different than an employment arrangement," he said. "That I would like to know if you would want that too, not as a pressure or an expectation, as a genuine question that you are free to answer any way." She looked at him. This man who had written back in 8 days, who had taken her bag without being asked, who said thank you and meant it, who had made and kept 2 promises to his wife and was trying to figure out how to be a person again, who had held her hand across his sleeping daughter on the drive home from El Paso. She said, "I have spent 3 years moving because standing still felt like being caught. This is the first place I have wanted to stand still." He said, "Is that an answer?" "It's the answer," she said. "Yes, I would want that." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and looked at her with those serious, deep eyes, and she looked back. And he raised his hand and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that was startling in a man whose hands were that large and that weathered. And she understood in that moment that this was how he would always handle things he considered worth protecting. He kissed her. Not with hesitation, not with urgency, but with the same quality of careful, complete attention he gave to everything he decided to do. She kissed him back and felt 3 years of forward-leaning tension go completely still. Me, coming in from her chores 7 minutes later, found them standing in the kitchen with their foreheads touching, talking quietly, and she looked at them with the profound satisfaction of someone who has been working toward an outcome and is experiencing its arrival as the natural consequence of applied effort. She went to the table and sat down and opened her school book as if nothing of particular significance had occurred, and both adults had the grace not to disturb the dignity of that moment by remarking on it. Christmas in the Cooper house that year was the richest Henrietta had experienced since before her parents died, not in material extravagance, but in the specific warmth of a house that has become a home by the deliberate choice of the people in it. She made a pine bough wreath from branches Oscar cut in the higher elevation scrub north of the ranch. She baked things she had not made in years, a Stollen from her German grandmother's recipe, ginger snaps, a spiced cake with molasses that filled the house with a smell that was almost too much like history. Me decorated the window with paper stars she cut with careful scissors, and they hung in the glass catching the winter light. And she received on Christmas morning a proper set of mathematical primers that Oscar had ordered through the general store in Sierra Blanca, and a small carved wooden horse that Henrietta had purchased in El Paso and wrapped in brown paper with a ribbon. Me turned the wooden horse over in her hands with the expression of someone receiving something that precisely matched an internal picture she had been carrying around. She looked at Henrietta. She said, "How did you know?" Henrietta said, "You look at the horses the way I used to look at books." Me stood up and walked around the table and hugged her. Not the careful shoulder contact of a child testing permission, but an actual, full, both arms hug, pressed in and held, the kind that means something that words do not cover. Oscar watched this from across the table and said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he said, his voice slightly rough, "Merry Christmas," and Henrietta, with her arms around his daughter, looked at him and said, "Merry Christmas, Oscar," and that was. They would all agree much later, the morning the Cooper house became complete. January brought news that Dawson had been formally investigated in connection with the fraudulent survey papers. Sheriff Aldred had traced the seal used on the false documents to a printing shop in Pecos that turned out to have done previous work for one of Dawson's employees, and Simon Arredondo in El Paso, who turned out to have the particular quality of a lawyer who enjoyed a fight on principle, had filed 3 separate legal challenges simultaneously that required Dawson's operation to produce documentation it apparently could not produce cleanly. Dawson came to the Cooper ranch one final time in the second week of January. He came alone this time, which was, Oscar said afterward, the only interesting thing about the visit, a man who had always brought company suddenly coming alone. Henrietta was in the kitchen when he arrived, and she stayed in the kitchen, but she left the kitchen door to the porch open and kept her hands busy and her ears available. Dawson's tone was different this time. The pleasant surface was still there, but the confidence underneath it was thinner, like ice over a creek in late winter that looks solid but has begun to flex. He said he wanted to settle this business amicably. He said he had always had the highest regard for Oscar and had perhaps been too aggressive in his approach. He said he was prepared to make a more appropriate offer. Oscar said, "I am not going to sell this land, Mr. Dawson. I would like that to be final." Dawson said he hoped Oscar would not let a small legal misunderstanding affect their relationship as neighbors. Oscar said, very quietly, with the particular gravity of a man who has decided something absolutely, "Those were not misunderstandings. Those were deliberate actions against my property and my household. My attorney in El Paso has everything documented, and it is in the hands of the county sheriff and the district court. If anything else happens to this property or to anyone associated with it, that documentation becomes part of a criminal proceeding. I'd like you to know that clearly before you leave." There was a silence from the porch. Then Dawson said, "I see you have some formidable support." Oscar said, "I do." Dawson left. He did not come back. Arredondo wrote in March to say that the investigation had produced enough irregularities in Dawson's previous land acquisitions that 2 of his neighbors had come forward with their own complaints, and the district attorney in El Paso was showing serious interest. Whether anything criminal would ultimately be proven remained to be seen, but Dawson's capacity to operate with impunity in Culberson County was, by all available evidence, concluded. Oscar read the letter at the kitchen table at breakfast and set it down and looked at Henrietta across the table. Me was between them, eating her biscuit with honey and reading her primer simultaneously. The biscuit left from last night's supper, the last one from the pan, set beside Henrietta's plate by me before either adult had come to the table. Oscar looked at the biscuit beside Henrietta's plate. He looked at me, not looking up. He looked at Henrietta. He said, "I have something I want to ask you." Me looked up from her primer. He said, "I would like to ask you to stay, not as an employee. As my wife, if you would have me." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the February desert had been surprised by a warm day, an anomaly, the kind of day that showed up occasionally in winter in West Texas like a reminder of what was coming, and the light through the kitchen window was long and gold. Henrietta looked at me, who was looking at her with the complete attention of someone for whom this is the most important question currently in the world. Then she looked at Oscar. She said, "Oscar Cooper, I came to this house with one bag and a secret, and no particular expectation of being anything more than useful. and somehow I find myself at a kitchen table that has the best light in the morning I have ever seen, with a child who saves me the last biscuit every morning, and explained to me last Tuesday why rational and right are not the same thing, being asked by a man who took my bag without being asked the first time we met, and has not once, not one single time, made me feel like a woman who should be smaller than she is. He was watching her very steadily. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." Me, with the timing of someone who has been working toward this outcome for months, put down her primer, picked up her biscuit, and continued eating as if the fundamental rightness of this moment required no further comment. Oscar reached across the table and covered Henrietta's hand with his, and they sat in the morning light, the three of them, in the kitchen that smelled of biscuits and coffee and the warm desert morning coming through the open door. They were married in April of 1884 at the small Methodist church in Sierra Blanca, with Sheriff Aldred as one witness and me as the other, standing beside Henrietta in a dress that had been made from a piece of blue calico that Henrietta had chosen specifically, because it matched the color of the Guadalupe Mountains on a clear day, which me had said was the most serious compliment available. The ceremony was brief and plain and absolutely real. Oscar's voice when he spoke his vows had the quality of something said by a man who had been choosing his words carefully for a long time and had finally found the right ones. Henrietta's voice was steady, which surprised her because she had expected to be nervous, but standing in front of this small congregation with Oscar beside her and me watching with those serious, bright eyes, she did not feel nervous. She felt, for the first time in years, entirely located, entirely in the right place. He put a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band that he had been keeping in the safe in the barn, and she looked at it on her hand in the April light coming through the church windows, and felt the past 3 years close behind her like a door swinging shut on something she had already survived and would not need to return to. They went home to the ranch in the late afternoon, and me fell asleep in the wagon before they were 3 miles out of town, and they drove home in the warm spring evening, side by side, his arm around her shoulders, the desert going from gold to rose to the deep purple of a West Texas evening, the mountains enormous and the sky enormous and everything in between precisely the right size. Spring turned to summer and summer to fall, and the ranch prospered in the way that ranches prosper when they are managed with sustained attention and mutual practical intelligence, which was what Oscar and Henrietta together amounted to. The North Pasture's spring-fed pond continued to be the best water source in the area, and they used it wisely. The cattle improved with careful breeding choices. The kitchen garden expanded. The chickens multiplied. Me grew 3 inches and read everything she could get her hands on and argued productively about most of it. Henrietta wrote a letter to Simon Arredondo in the spring asking if there was any avenue remaining to revisit the land fraud that had cost her family's hill country property. She did not expect much. She had been down that road and knew its dead ends. Arredondo wrote back 6 weeks later to say that there had been a development of some interest. Gerald Fitch, the former deputy land commissioner, had made an enemy 2 years ago in Austin who had now become a district court judge, and the new judge had a particular interest in reopening land fraud cases from the period in question as part of a larger investigation into corruption in the land commissioner's office. Arredondo said her case was not the strongest, but it was not the weakest, and he would like to try. She sat with that letter for a long time before she showed it to Oscar. He read it and said, "Do you want to try?" She said, "I don't expect to get the land back. Too much has been built on it." But she thought of her father, of the hill country farm that had smelled of cedar and the specific good smell of good dirt, that had been worked by her grandfather's hands and her father's hands and briefly her own. She thought of what it would mean to have it formally acknowledged that it had been stolen, even if the acknowledgement came too late to restore the thing itself. "Yes," she said, "I want to try." It took 1.5 years and 2 trips to Austin and more correspondence than she had ever produced in her life, and it cost money they had not budgeted for, and it produced not the return of the land, which was, as she had expected, impossible, but a formal judicial finding that the sale had been conducted fraudulently, that Gerald Fitch had been acting in criminal conspiracy with the railroad consortium, and that Henrietta Keller Cooper was entitled to damages to be assessed against the assets of the consortium. The consortium had lawyers who were very good at making damages small. What arrived in the end was not a restoration of everything, but it was a real sum, enough to add a room to the house and substantially increase the herd, and it was accompanied by a document from the district court that said, in formal legal language, what she had known and been unable to prove for years, that what had been done to her had been a crime, that the ground had been lying, not her. She kept that document in the safe in the barn alongside Oscar's deeds. Their first child, a boy, was born in the summer of 1886. They named him Thomas after Oscar's father, and he arrived in the world with the specific intention of making his opinions known immediately, which he did at considerable volume, and me, who had been present for the birth in the capable company of the midwife from Sierra Blanca, looked at her new brother with an expression of fascinated assessment and said, "He is very loud." "He takes after someone," Oscar said, looking at Henrietta. Henrietta, who was exhausted and triumphant, and holding her son, and entirely certain she was among the happiest people currently existing in the state of Texas, said, "I am perfectly quiet." Me said, with the precise deadpan of a 10-year-old who has been taking notes, "You argued with the midwife about the timing for 20 minutes. That was a professional disagreement," Henrietta said. Oscar Cooper laughed in that full, genuine way she had first heard at the restaurant in El Paso and had been collecting ever since, and the sound of it filled the bedroom and went out the window into the West Texas summer morning. Thomas Cooper was loud and opinionated and deeply physical in his engagement with the world, which by the time he was walking made life at the Cooper ranch extremely dynamic. He went at everything without hesitation, and without the instinct for caution that me had been born with, and me, with the serious concern of a much older sibling, began almost immediately teaching him the things he needed to know about not getting hurt, which he mostly ignored and she provided anyway. Me's relationship with Henrietta had by now become something so natural and constant that it was difficult to remember, except in the particular way of things that matter too much to forget, that it had required building at all. Me called her Mama with the ease of someone for whom this had simply become the accurate word. She was 12, 13, already showing the particular kind of intelligence that would require, Henrietta was certain, more than Sierra Blanca's small schoolhouse could offer, and she had begun writing to the Girls' Academy in San Antonio requesting information about their programs, because she was going to find a way to give me the education that mine deserved. Oscar had sat with the prospectus from the academy for a long evening, working through the numbers and the logistics and the reality of what it would mean for me to leave for the school year. He had said, finally, she should go. Henrietta said, "It's expensive. We'll manage. She'll be away for months. She'll write long letters," he said, "and she'll come home better equipped to argue with us about everything, which she currently seems to find somewhat limiting." Henrietta looked at him across the table and felt the warm amusement she felt constantly in the company of this man. She said, "You are going to miss her desperately." He said, "Every day." He paused. "But Clara made me promise to not let her grow up surrounded only by grief, and I've extended that promise to not letting her grow up smaller than she is." Me was told about the academy possibility on a Sunday evening in October, and received the information with the specific, contained excitement of someone who does not let themselves believe things fully until they are confirmed. And then, when it was confirmed that they meant it, that she was going in January if she was accepted, she had gone outside and stood on the porch and looked at the mountains for a long time. When she came back and she said, "Will Thomas be all right?" Henrietta said, Thomas is currently attempting to relocate the cat from the barn to the kitchen and showing every sign of succeeding. He will be fine. Me laughed. And then very quietly she said, "Thank you." Neither of them asked which one of them she was talking to. It was clearly both. The second baby, a girl this time, came in the spring of 1888. A mild surprise in her timing but entirely welcome. And they named her Clara because it was time. Because Oscar had said quietly one evening that he thought his wife would have liked Henrietta very much, and that the name should be in the house again. Not as a ghost, but as an honor. And Henrietta had felt the truth of that settle in her chest like something finding its place after a long journey. Clara Cooper arrived with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and a personality that became apparent immediately as neither of the above. Entirely her own, serene and watchful where Thomas was loud and energetic, deliberate where me had been quiet, already assessing the world with the confidence of someone who expects it to be interesting. Me came home from the academy for the summer with new knowledge and new vocabulary, and a particular kind of intellectual confidence that was deeply becoming on her, and not even slightly diminished by the fact that she was also, within 48 hours of being home, barefoot in the kitchen garden arguing with Thomas about whether his identification of a particular weed was correct. It was not. She was right. He disputed it for 30 more minutes on principle before conceding. Henrietta watched this from the porch with Clara on her hip, and felt the full, particular richness of this life she had arrived at from the other side of loss. This life she had not planned and had not been prepared for, and had been given anyway, biscuit by biscuit, morning by morning, in a kitchen that had the best light she had ever seen. Oscar came to stand beside her on the porch, having emerged from the barn with the look of a man who has solved a mechanical problem and is satisfied about it. He looked at the kitchen garden, at me and Thomas in vigorous debate about botanical taxonomy, at his wife holding their daughter in the spring afternoon light. He said, "What are you thinking about?" she said, "about arriving." "At what?" She looked at him. "Here. I spent 3 years in motion, and I kept thinking there was something ahead of me, past the next town, past the next job, past the next loss. And I am thinking about how I ended up arriving at exactly this." He slipped his arm around her waist, careful of Clara, who was doing her serious small-person assessment of the middle distance. He said, "I am glad you wrote that letter. I am glad you wrote back in 8 days. 8 days was me being cautious," he said. "I wrote my response the same day and held it for 5 days before I let myself send it." She looked at him. "Oscar Cooper." I did not want to seem desperate. Were you? He considered this with the seriousness he gave to things that were genuinely serious. "I was ready," he said, which at that point felt the same. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he pressed his mouth to the top of her hair. And Clara, between them, reached out and took a fistful of Oscar's shirt with the proprietary grip of an 8-month-old who understands ownership thoroughly. And Thomas's voice from the garden carried the particular indignant register of someone who has just been proven definitively wrong, and is working through the stages of accepting it. And me's response was calm and specific and completely correct. The sun was going down behind the house, going west the way the sun goes west in West Texas with tremendous commitment, turning the mountains every improbable color in succession, the light coming off the Guadalupes and painting the whole eastern desert orange and rose, and the Cooper Ranch sat in it the way a thing that belongs somewhere sits, settled, rooted, present. Henrietta thought about the biscuit. She thought about waking up for 6 weeks to find one wrapped in cheesecloth beside her door, about eating it alone in the dark, about the particular lonely gratitude of receiving kindness without understanding it. She thought about finding me in the kitchen at 5 in the morning with her twine and her grave expression, and the admission that she looked hungry, not for food, just hungry. She thought about how that small, deliberate act of a child who was herself hungry, who had been surviving on her own particular reserves for 2 years, and had still noticed someone else's need and done something about it, how that had been the first unlocking. The first morning she had stopped moving inside herself. She thought about how sometimes grace arrives not in the forms you have been prepared to recognize it in. Sometimes it arrives as an 8-year-old in braids with cheesecloth and twine, saving you the last biscuit like it is a sacred thing, because she has decided that you matter before you have figured out how to matter to yourself. Me came up from the garden with a sprig of something in her hand, and Thomas behind her wearing the expression of someone who is thinking very hard about whether to continue the argument on different grounds. Me stopped at the foot of the porch and looked up at her parents and her sister and said, with the precision of someone who has been educated well and has always used that education in service of things she actually cared about, "There will be rain tonight. The barometric pressure has dropped and the west wind has shifted and the horses are restless in the pasture." Oscar looked at the sky. "Good rain or bad rain?" "I think good rain," Me said. "The kind that doesn't flood, just settles." Henrietta smiled. "Your grandmother's German settlers would have said that kind of rain is a kindness." Me tilted her head. "Are you going to tell me the strudel story again?" "I am definitely going to tell you the strudel story again," Henrietta said. "With embellishments." Thomas, finding that the botanical argument had somehow transformed into a story situation without his input, abandoned his dispute entirely and came to sit on the porch steps with the reliable enthusiasm of someone who understands that embellished stories are never a bad development. Me sat beside him. Clara transferred her grip from Oscar's shirt to Henrietta's braid and settled in with the confidence of someone who has correctly identified the most secure available location. Oscar sat down on the porch bench and Henrietta sat beside him, and the ranch spread out before them in the last of the orange light, and she began to tell the story she had told once before at a kitchen table to a child who had not yet decided whether she was safe, and it was a better story this time, fuller, warmer, with all the details she had not included the first time because she had not yet known she was allowed to take up that much space. Me laughed in the right places. Thomas asked impractical questions. Clara observed everything with complete seriousness. And Oscar Cooper listened to his wife tell a story on their porch in the West Texas evening with his arm around her, and the sound of her voice carrying everything that had come before, and everything that was present and everything that was still ahead. And he looked like a man who had made 2 promises to someone he loved and had found, in the completely unplanned and entirely necessary arrival of a woman with 1 bag and a secret, and the most honest letter he had ever received. The way to keep them both. The rain came after dark exactly as Me had predicted. Good rain, the settling kind. The kind that comes in quietly and does what it means to do, and leaves the ground better for it in the morning. Inside the Cooper house, the fire was built up against the evening chill, and the lamps were lit, and Thomas had fallen asleep on the floor in the particular sudden way of small children, who run out of energy between one breath and the next, and Clara was in her cradle, and Me was at the kitchen table doing the advanced arithmetic that the academy had assigned for her summer work, with the focused pleasure of someone doing the thing they are best suited for. Henrietta washed the supper dishes and Oscar dried them, their hands occasionally passing something between them, and the rain talked on the roof with the easy, rhythmic certainty of something that has no need to be anything other than what it is. Oscar said, "I have been thinking about the north pasture fence," she said. "The cedar post by the second gate needs replacing." He looked at her. "I was going to say that." "I know," she said. "I've been meaning to mention it." He shook his head, not in disagreement but in the particular way of someone who is pleased by being understood and slightly incredulous that it keeps happening. He said, "Henrietta Cooper." She handed him the last plate. "Oscar Cooper." He set the plate on the shelf and turned and leaned against the counter, and looked at her in the lamplight with the rain on the roof and the fire and his daughter doing mathematics at the table and their son asleep on the floor. And his expression was everything that had no cleaner name than love, the practiced, daily, deeply chosen kind, the kind that is not arrived at by accident but tended like a kitchen garden, deliberately, persistently, through cold and drought, and whatever else the West Texas seasons bring. He said, "I am glad you are here." She looked at him across the kitchen that smelled of the supper she had made, and the rain coming in through the open window above the sink, and the biscuits she would make in the morning, enough for everyone, every last one of them. She said, "So am I." Me looked up from her arithmetic and said, with the air of someone making an observation that is simultaneously obvious and essential, "You two are always glad." Henrietta said, "Is that a problem?" Me considered this with the full intelligence she brought to everything worth considering. Then she said, "No," and went back to her numbers. The rain settled in over the Cooper Ranch and the Guadalupe Mountains and the whole of the West Texas night, and the fire burned steady against the chill. And in the morning, there would be biscuits and coffee, and the good smell of rain-cleaned desert, and the cedar post that needed replacing in the north pasture fence, and the mathematics that needed finishing, and Thomas, who would wake up at dawn with the energy of something that had been wound up overnight, and Clara, who would observe everything seriously from her cradle, and me, who would eat her biscuit with honey, and go out to check the barometric pressure, and Oscar, who would come in from the barn and pour his coffee at the kitchen table and say good morning to everyone in it. And there would be the biscuit beside Henrietta's place, wrapped in cheesecloth now by habit and love rather than necessity, because some gestures become rituals, and some rituals become the shape of what a family means to itself, become the daily, physical, warm and practical evidence of the fact that you are here and counted and fed and not alone. The last biscuit every morning like a sacred thing, because it was.